In the year 1284, the town of Hamelin faced a dire crisis. The town, nestled in the Lower Saxony region of Germany, was under siege by an overwhelming plague of rats. The vermin invaded homes, infested granaries, and gnawed at the very fabric of daily life. The townspeople were desperate, their pleas for help echoing through the narrow cobblestone streets. Hamelin's mayor, Hans von Dorf, was a man of great pride and ambition. He saw the rat infestation as a personal affront to his leadership. He called a meeting in the town hall, where anxious citizens gathered to voice their grievances. "We cannot live like this," cried Greta, a mother of 3. "Our children are sick, our food is contaminated. We need a solution now." "We've tried everything," said the town's ratcatcher, Klaus. "Traps, poisons, nothing works. These rats are too clever." Desperation hung thick in the air when suddenly the door to the hall creaked open. A tall, slender man in a vibrant, multicolored coat stepped inside. His presence commanded immediate attention. He carried a flute, and his eyes, though sharp and piercing, held a strange, magnetic charm. "I am the Pied Piper," he announced, his voice smooth and confident. "I can rid your town of rats, but my services come at a price." Mayor von Dorf, seeing a glimmer of hope, stepped forward. "Name your price, and if you succeed, we will pay you handsomely." The piper smiled, a cold and calculating expression. 1,000 guilders. Half now, and half upon completion. The townspeople gasped at the steep price, but their desperation overrode their caution. The mayor agreed, and the piper was given his initial payment. Without another word, the piper took to the streets. The next morning, the piper began his work. He stood in the center of the town square and lifted his flute to his lips. The melody that flowed from his instrument was unlike anything the townspeople had ever heard. It was enchanting, bewitching, and hauntingly beautiful. As the music filled the air, the rats emerged from every nook and cranny, drawn to the sound as if by an invisible force. The piper led the vermin through the streets, out of the town, and towards the Weser River. Mesmerized by the melody, the rats followed him in a trance-like state. One by one, they plunged into the river and drowned. By the end of the day, not a single rat remained in Hamelin. The town erupted in celebration. The nightmare was over, and the piper was hailed as a hero. But when he returned to collect the remainder of his payment, the mood shifted. "We have reconsidered your fee," Mayor von Dorf said, his tone dismissive. "Surely, such a simple task does not warrant such an extravagant reward. We will pay you 50 guilders, and that is generous." The piper's eyes narrowed, his earlier charm replaced by a steely resolve. "We had an agreement," he said. "You must honor it." But the townsfolk, emboldened by their newfound freedom, jeered and laughed at him. They believed they had outsmarted the stranger, and no longer feared him. The piper's expression darkened. "You will regret this," he warned, his voice cold and foreboding. "I will have my payment, one way or another." That night, as the town of Hamelin slept, the piper returned. He moved through the streets like a shadow, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. He raised his flute once more and began to play a new melody, one far darker and more sinister than before. This time, it was not the rats that responded to his call, but the children of Hamelin. 130 boys and girls, from the youngest toddler to the oldest teenager, rose from their beds and, as if in a trance, followed the piper. They moved silently through the streets, their faces blank and unseeing. The piper led them out of the town, up the mountain path, and to a hidden cave. As dawn broke, the parents awoke to find their children gone. Panic and hysteria gripped the town. The parents searched frantically, but there was no trace of their children or the piper. The mayor and his counselors were at a loss. They had underestimated the stranger, and now they were paying a terrible price. Desperate and broken, the townspeople prayed for a miracle, but none came. The children followed the piper into the depths of the cave. The walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense. The piper led them to an underground chamber, where an altar stood at the center, surrounded by a circle of flickering candles. The piper stopped playing and turned to face the children. "You have been chosen," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Your innocence and purity will fuel a great power, one that will change the world." The children, still under his spell, stood silently as the piper began to chant. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the air hummed with energy. A dark shadow emerged from the altar, taking the form of a tall, imposing figure with eyes like burning coals. "You have done well," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "The children are mine." The piper bowed his head. "As promised, Master. Now, grant me the power I seek." The figure raised its hand, and a bolt of dark energy shot out, striking the piper. He screamed as the energy coursed through his body, transforming him. His eyes glowed with the same fiery light as the figure's, and his skin turned ashen and cold. The children began to chant, their voices joining the piper's in a chorus of dark magic. The ground trembled, and the energy in the chamber intensified. The figure raised its arms, and the piper felt his power surge. The piper's body twisted and contorted as the dark energy consumed him. He felt his humanity slipping away, replaced by a cold, unfeeling darkness. The figure watched with a satisfied grin as the transformation took hold. When it was over, the piper was no longer a man. He had become something else, something dark and powerful. He looked down at his hands, now twisted and claw-like, and felt a surge of power coursing through him. The figure stepped forward. "You are now my servant," it said. "You will spread fear and darkness across the land. The children will remain here, their souls feeding my power." The piper nodded, his mind filled with dark thoughts and visions. He turned to the children, who stood silently, their eyes still blank. He raised his flute and began to play a new melody, one that would bind them to the figure's will forever. The piper returned to Hamelin, but he was no longer the man the townsfolk remembered. He moved through the streets like a shadow, his eyes burning with dark energy. The people who saw him felt a chill run down their spines, but they did not recognize him for what he had become. The town was in chaos. The parents of the missing children were frantic, searching everywhere for any sign of their lost sons and daughters. The mayor had called for help from neighboring towns, but no one had seen the children or the piper. The piper watched from the shadows, a twisted smile on his lips. He knew that the townsfolk would never find their children, for they were now bound to the figure's dark will. He felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had fulfilled his promise of revenge. But his work was not done. The figure had given him a new purpose, and he intended to carry it out. He would spread darkness and fear wherever he went, using his newfound power to bring misery and despair to all who crossed his path. The piper traveled from town to town, spreading his dark influence. He played his flute, luring children away from their homes and into the figure's clutches. Each time, the townsfolk would wake to find their children gone, their hearts filled with fear and sorrow. The piper's legend grew, but it was no longer a tale of a man who rid a town of rats. It became a story of terror and loss, of a dark figure who stole children away in the night. Parents would whisper the tale to their children, warning them to stay close and never follow strange music. The figure's power grew with each child taken, and the piper felt his own strength increasing. He reveled in the fear and chaos he created, finding joy in the misery of others. But deep down, a part of him still remembered who he had once been. A part of him longed for the days before the darkness had consumed him. Word of the piper's deeds reached the ears of a group of knights sworn to protect the innocent. Led by Sir Cedric, a brave and noble warrior, they vowed to put an end to the piper's reign of terror. They tracked him to a small village, where he had recently taken a group of children. The knights confronted the piper in the village square. Sir Cedric stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the sunlight. "Pied Piper," he called out, "your reign of terror ends here. Release the children and face justice for your crimes." The piper laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You cannot stop me," he said, his voice filled with dark confidence. "I have powers beyond your understanding." Sir Cedric raised his sword. "We will see about that," he said, and charged. The battle was fierce, the knights fighting with all their might against the piper's dark magic. The piper played his flute, summoning shadows and illusions to confuse and disorient his foes. But the knights were determined, their resolve unshakable. In the end, it was Sir Cedric who landed the final blow. He struck the piper's flute, shattering it into pieces. The piper screamed as the dark energy that had consumed him began to dissipate. As the darkness left him, the piper fell to his knees, his body weak and broken. Sir Cedric approached him, his sword still drawn. "It is over," he said. "The children are free." The piper looked up at him, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." Sir Cedric knelt beside him, his expression softening. "We all have the power to choose our path," he said. "You chose revenge, but you can still find redemption." The piper nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will try," he said. "For the children." With Sir Cedric's help, the piper led the knights to the hidden cave. The children, freed from the figure's control, were returned to their families. The town of Hamelin rejoiced, their sorrow replaced by joy. The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin became a legend, but not the one the townsfolk had expected. It was a tale of darkness and redemption, of a man who had been consumed by revenge but found a way to presumably save the innocent in the end. The children who had been taken grew up with a deep respect for the power of music and the dangers of dark magic. They passed the story down to their own children, a cautionary tale of the price of vengeance and the power of forgiveness. Though their parents always stated the children were somehow different since their return by the piper. And not necessarily different in a good way. As for the fate of the man known only as the Pied Piper, it is said he continued his travels but without conflict. But it is also rumored that he was much more than a mortal man. That his evil presence merely shifted shape and form, and he still stalks the lands to this day wherever darkness, despair, and sorrow can be found. An evil as old as time.